Yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay. Okay, hello everyone. Whether you are joining us virtually or in person, welcome to the Center for Engineering, Innovation, and Design. My name is Joseph Zinter, and I'm really excited to be hosting today's panel discussion on positive sum design. Joining us today will be Ruth Schmidt, Associate Professor at the Institute of Design at Illinois Tech, Will Rudder, who received his MA in Design from Carnegie Mellon and is currently pursuing a Master's in Design and a Master's in Public Policy, also at Illinois Tech. Arthi Krishnaswamy, who's an adjunct professor of the practice at Carnegie Mellon School of Design and founder of the Rycatcher Education and Community Success Institute. And Ian Gonsher, an assistant professor of the practice in engineering and computer science at Brown, and a lecturer here at the School of Engineering and Applied Science at Yale. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we're all looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
So I think, Will, are you going to start us off?
Oh, Will is muted. We're Zoom teching, guys. We're going to get the Zoom working, and I'm going to try not to fog up the whole time.
Oh, wait, looks like I can talk now. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Fabulous, all right. Wonderful, thank you so much for that introduction, Joe. And it's a real pleasure and privilege to be here speaking with you all today. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of context about how this conversation and this group of people actually came to be. At the end of 2020, I found myself pretty distressed by the state of the world, and at that time I don't think that was an unusual experience. However, the nature of my concern might have been a little uncommon. I've had an interest in the physics and the economic views created for and by people for a really long time. And one of the things that you learn about if you study this sort of thing is called the lump sum fallacy, which buys into this idea that value, however you measure it, is strictly zero sums. There's this fixed amount of value in the world, and what really matters is how you divide that value up amongst people. And so I was looking around at this, just a lot of the conversation being had in public and private at the time. And I found myself really concerned with what I felt was this sort of epidemic of zero sum, lump sum, fallacious thinking. And the more I thought about this, the more I found myself struck by how this zero-sum thinking was manifesting and maybe even growing in design discourse. This seemed tremendously counterproductive to me, and so I began to consider how my personal practice of design might explicitly involve some sort of positive sum orientation that challenges zero-sum thinking. And this wasn't really something that one could just take a class in at CMU at the time, so I decided to undertake an independent study, which is sort of the avenue CMU provides for students who want to study something outside what's covered in the standard curriculum. And so I began researching, and as far as I could tell, the only person online who had ever placed the word positive sum design in that order was Ian here. In a set of articles, especially he wrote in 2017. And so I emailed him and I asked him if he'd be willing to have a conversation with me about these ideas just to help direct my research. I sort of expected this to be a one-off thing, but that conversation became a series of bi-weekly conversations, and during which we discussed all sorts of topics that I was considering in my independent study and that he was developing in his own scholarship. And then in parallel to this process, I was also taking a course at CMU in Design for Social Innovation, which is taught by Arthi. And as that class progressed, I noted how much of the philosophical stance that Arthi taught had a lot of synergy with some of the things Ian and I were talking about, and I thought that she could elevate that conversation with insights from her practice, from her experience, from her teaching, her approach. And so after talking about the project with her, she agreed to join the conversation, I think about a year ago. And then after I moved my studies over to the Institute of Design at Illinois Tech, I happened to have the privilege of getting assigned Ruth here as my advisor. And after learning more about her work, which she'll explain better than I can later, it became clear that she would be an awesome addition to the positive sum design conversation. So I'm sort of rambling on about this, not simply to bore you all, but to underscore how the history of this conversation is, in sort of an interesting way, a meta example of the subject matter itself. This idea that positive sum design has exhibited and benefited from positive sum effects, bringing more people together, having discussions, considering how design can create positive sum dynamics. All of that has helped this set of ideas sort of develop faster and develop more impact for practice and create value for more people. And so in lots of ways, that's sort of the point of today, of this conversation as well, to invite all the folks here sort of taking part in this conversation, and all folks joining over Zoom, the folks joining live, to really come together and join the conversation and add your own point of view. But first, I think we should probably introduce the idea of positive sum design in more detail. And to do that, I'm going to hand it off to Ian, who's formulated and expressed these ideas really well through his writing and his thinking.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, so just kind of give a basic overview of how we're thinking about some of these topics. We're looking at positive sum design, both in terms of the theory and the design practice, but also trying to develop some design methods to develop pedagogies around these things as well. And there's some kind of major themes that have started to emerge. One is, as Will points out, this kind of critique of zero-sum bias. Why do we look at the world, we tend to look at the world in kind of win-lose kinds of games? And how, as designers and engineers and other kinds of people that are interested in these things, how can we leverage our creativity to reframe those games, to reframe it in a way where we can find positive benefits for everybody? And that goes to this question of constraints. It's the way that we tend to take constraints as certain kinds of givens in particular situations. And we've kind of been playing with this term, the mutability of constraints, thinking about how constraints can be mutable and how they can be changed so that you can change a situation that looks like it has a scarcity into a situation that has more abundance. And so the kinds of design methods, the kinds of pedagogy that we explore in our class can be applied to some of these contexts in different ways to reframe a situation that apparently has scarcity into something that has more abundance. And we think that designers and designer-like people, engineers, you can kind of broaden that tent as much as you want, are well positioned to think about these things in a different way. So that's one major idea that's behind this. And more broadly, we're interested in the idea of creativity and the way that creativity can be leveraged to kind of solve these kinds of grand challenges. The big challenges that we all will face in the 21st century that aren't necessarily zero-sum problems, although they often get framed like that. You can probably pick any one you want. I mean, climate change is a great example, right? That's not really a zero-sum kind of situation. We're all kind of in the same boat, but yet it gets framed that way, especially in political discourse. So we're also interested in maybe thinking about how we might imagine a kind of post-political kind of dialogue where there's a kind of solutionism, or if you want to kind of put it that way, there's a way of kind of thinking about how to frame the problem so that everybody can benefit. And so that goes back to this idea of creativity. So creativity can kind of be looked at two different scales. One scale is individual creativity, and that's what we do in a lot of our classes. We're learning about creative process. We learn about how to take ideas and translate them into tangible, testable things. There's also another scale that you can look at creativity. That's kind of an historical scale, or a kind of civilization scale of creativity, and thinking about the idea of progress and the way that we can use our creativity as designers to be able to leverage these kinds of, to optimize kind of these win-wins to be able to create more benefits for everybody. So it's kind of in this kind of consequentialist or utilitarian framework that we're working to try to build the most possible good for the most amount of people, and doing that through these design methods that we're trying to develop here. Another thing that we talk a lot about is the way that we think about value and meaning, and the way that those things tend to get constrained in very particular ways. And we've talked a lot about in some of our conversations about different kinds of currency, if you want to think of it that way, different ways we can think about what payoffs are. And that doesn't have to be consistent across all stakeholders. One way we've phrased this question, it's not just a matter of thinking about how you get what you want in a particular situation. It's a more fundamental question of why do you want what you want? And what we've come to discover is that oftentimes many people want different things in the situation, although the way that it gets framed is that everybody's competing over the same kind of resources. And we think that designers have, and design in general, have some insights to offer to ways of reframing some of those situations. We're looking at positive sum design as a kind of design practice, thinking about design as a kind of mode of inquiry, a way of asking questions about the world, and being able to design interventions that respond to that in some way. And out of that, we're interested in creating more kinds of design methods where we can take some of these other disciplines that we're looking at, game theory, behavioral economics, and try to apply some of those ways of visualizing problems to design discourse and to design practice. And finally, it's kind of a commentary on design itself. I mean, design is everywhere. I mean, this room, this space, these desks, the clothes we're wearing, everything that's in this space was designed by people for people. And when you kind of look at the world in that way, you start to see these opportunities to be able to recalibrate the way that we interact with each other through design. And we think that through kind of a careful analysis of the way that we kind of frame what's at stake, the way that we frame our values and meanings, the way we think about the currencies that we exchange that have these values and meanings, design has something to offer by the way that we kind of build these infrastructures, which Ruth will talk a little bit more about in a minute. So those are kind of the general kinds of themes that we've been exploring, but we're also very much interested in kind of broadening the conversation and expanding our thinking here. So we invite all of you to join our conversation. We have a website which we'll share the link to at the end of the talk, and we'd love to hear your thoughts as well. How can we think about reframing the game? How can we think about value and meaning in different ways? How can we think about designing for abundance rather than scarcity? How can we think about getting beyond this kind of lump sum fallacy, as Will articulated, getting beyond zero-sum bias towards creative thinking that allows us to see opportunities for everybody to be able to contribute and to be able to have their needs met. I'll hand it over to Arthi now.
Awesome. Thank you, Ian. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Joe, for having us and for the lovely introduction. So I just want to kind of extend the conversation from the theory into the practice, which is pretty much what I'm always doing. So as Will mentioned, I teach a class called Design for Social Innovation at Carnegie Mellon. And what we try to do in that class is use design, technology, entrepreneurship, and public policy together in the service of solving social problems, whether they be education, healthcare, climate, whatever those problems might be. And in that work, where I began was actually in public policy analysis and in the design of education services. And I had the opportunity about 10 years ago to work on the Obama-sponsored My Data initiatives, where what we were asked to do was to use open and available student data to improve student outcomes. And the product and service that we decided to build was something to help children that had special needs or came from at-risk environments connect to their local providers to help to support their academic, behavior, social, and emotional needs. So we built a product, and it's an application that schools can use. It's called Rycatcher, and so they buy it, and they buy it or they buy another service to help to support students and families. And what I realized as we were doing this work was that we were working in a zero-sum way. We were working in a way that resources were scarce. There's only a certain limited number of resources available for children, available for schools, and so the entire education sector was framed in a way that was zero-sum. And what I realized was that what we think about in schools is that schools are the place where change happens for students and families, that is the nexus, that's the place where all of the things happen. But what we know is from 30 years of research on wraparound services and integrated services, student outcomes and student support happens in school, out of school, at home, and in the communities, all over the place. And if we think about things in a competitive way, if we think about schools as the only place where this happens, then we are dealing with a natural scarcity, which is a zero-sum frame of the educational ecosystem. And so what we came to realize was framing things in this way prioritize giving one entity or another entity credit for student success or outcomes. So it was really pitting people against each other to try to help students, instead of having all of these different parts of the network work together to support students and to support outcomes. And so what we realized was that instead of building products and services that were inherently competitive, that were inherently built on scarcity and a limited number of resources for schools, instead we wanted to expand our definition and say, let's reframe this game into something where we actually take into account what is happening in the home, what is happening in the family, what's happening in the community, and rather than having all of those entities fight against each other for control or for power or for impacting the student, let's have them work together. Let's have them work together to build communities of trust where they're sharing information, they're using network principles, they're working together to improve student outcomes. So the currency, as Ian was talking about, is no longer time, scarce resources, scarce dollars, but it is about sharing resources and bringing people together to positively improve student outcomes. So rather than having a zero-sum world where organizations, social services, schools are all competing for resources, instead, they will share resources, come together, share data, share information, make better decisions in real time, thereby growing social capital, improving the network, and actually improving student outcomes, not by using scarcity, but instead by using collective impact and support altogether. So we sought to reframe the game, and we built a nonprofit called the Community Success Institute, which takes tools and services, develops them openly, uses collaborative methods with community members, schools, families, and students all together to bring people together so that they can help to share and define different goals, better values. They can actually help them to improve student outcomes, not in a competitive way where they're competing for scarce resources, but in a way where they're actually collaborating to put their resources together to improve student outcomes. And so what we sought to do was, instead of having it be a zero-sum frame, have it be a positive-sum frame where people are working together, the network effects improve, and we improve the entire ecosystem rather than dividing the entire ecosystem. So what we're trying to do is to shift from individual benefit, individual currency, individual organizations taking credit for student outcomes, to a system where what we're actually trying to do is help the system get better so that student outcomes, community outcomes, and family outcomes can all come up together rather than being divided and having to compete for scarce resources. So we're trying to shift that conversation and the problem from individuals to systems. We are trying to figure out ways to have stakeholders that previously would be competing with each other for resources, actually trying to find ways to work together to either share resources and share data to ultimately improve student outcomes. So some of the questions and things that we are thinking about that we're struggling with are things that you can probably see are pretty clear. Many of our ecosystems right now are built for competition. There are scarce resources. Stakeholders are all competing for the same thing. How do we shift that and change that so that we can encourage stakeholders and individuals and organizations to work together so that they're not actually competing, but they're actually collaborating? And that is going to require a fundamental shift in thinking, a fundamental shift in values, and possibly a shift in how we think about currency and credit and rewards in these ecosystems. And so just to give as an example, this is how positive sum design or removing the zero-sum bias can help us to reframe the game for an entire sector. So education is a sector that I've worked on a lot, and it's an area that I know, but as Ian said, this type of exemplar could be found in so many other sectors as well. Just thought that we would use education as a place to kind of ground it, one that you're all probably quite familiar with, where you can think about competition, scarcity, and resources in your own environments, in your own context, to perhaps help us think through some of these questions and problems. So from here, I think what we'd like to do now is to shift. So we started to talk a little bit about choice, about shifting from individuals to systems, to Ruth, who's going to kind of continue that a little bit further into choice architecture and infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you. And it's kind of nice being the last of this sequence because I get to build on everything you all have been saying. Yeah, so my entry into this conversation, as Will kind of teed up at the very beginning, is that my area of specialty is behavioral design, and more specifically behavioral design in systems contexts. So for those unfamiliar with behavioral design or behavioral science, it's essentially exactly tackling what Arthi was just describing, which is, when confronted by choice, how do you make decisions? And even more specifically, how do you sort of learn from a lot of experimental findings that help us to figure out where people are not quote unquote rational about those choices. So there's a whole slew of research and literature that helps us to understand why people make the choices they do that may or may not be rational, again in quotes. But those experiments are usually focused on individual choice making. And as a designer, what I find really interesting about that field is if we think about that in a broader way, if we think about it in terms of systems and in terms of broader human interactions, we can actually start to address some of these very interesting challenges in new ways, because we're bringing insight into sort of known challenges, things like sustainability, things like these zero-sum outcomes, and we can use a bit of that behavioral science lens to understand what's going on. But and this is piggybacking on Ian, what you teed up, we are also designing always into conditions, right? We're never just designing into vacuums or to people just as individuals sitting on by themselves. When we're thinking about designing for people who are working within systems, we really have to be considering what are the norms that are underlying what people are doing. What are the things that, as Arthi is teeing up, this idea of currency. If certain things are respected or rewarded, those tend to be the things that people gravitate towards. So even kind of using the education example and extending it, if we think about something like grades, there are very clear reasons why people want good grades, right? It feels good, you get a good grade, you feel like that looks good on your transcript, but also you feel good about it. So there are those internal kind of personal intrinsic rewards. But we also know that trading grades for things like getting into graduate school are a different kind of currency that start to speak much more towards a systems perspective. So in terms of transitioning and reframing what we may think of as traditionally zero-sum games into positive sum, we also need to be considering how individual choices and individual behaviors and individual values may or may not be reinforced by these larger systems. So as a behavioral designer, that's kind of the slant that I find really interesting and incredibly high potential about bringing this positive sum conversation and thinking about how we can expand on it more broadly. Because we're not just designing for what is often called in the behavioral parlance choice architecture, which is about kind of very, tends to be small scale, kind of closing the loop behaviors, and shifting our minds into what I've been calling choice infrastructure, which is to say we're actually looking at how systems operate and understanding why it is, for example, that the way that systems are structured may reinforce certain kinds of values and behaviors, or the ways in which certain kinds of processes, like if we think again about the example of grades, the way that you get grades and the whole process for getting into schools, those are kind of outside of any of our individual control. And yet we're kind of privy to that, and when we start to move through it, it's the process itself that is sort of informing and imposing certain kinds of value. So we need to be understanding how processes and mechanics and even policies, Arthi mentioned public policy, for example, like there are a lot of ways in which public policy itself, I would argue, is kind of formulated to keep things zero-sum simply because that's the way that policy operates. So it's in a sense, it's not a surprise that we as individuals are found probably assuming that there's a zero-sum situation, because in many systems, that is kind of what's imposed from the top down. We can also be thinking about things like agency and power. So who's accountable for making certain choices can be a way that we also start to tease apart and understand why certain values get sort of codified. And then also realizing how our own behaviors get reinforced. So there are some, one of the things that I've been starting to think about and share with these folks, and we're kind of in transitioning from understanding what positive sum thinking might be and what kinds of solutions may look like, to how do we systematize that? What are ways in which designers can not only be part of that conversation, but to actually start to introduce tools, methodologies, and introduce new ways of thinking about what a positive sum design is, but even more importantly, be creating tools and methods where we can be engaging others, where there can be, for example, participatory design that helps individuals who are maybe stuck in these zero cycles to reframe and think differently about what good looks like. So in sort of considering and bringing this behavioral lens, I think what I'm very, very excited about in this broader conversation is that it allows us to piggyback on some of what is existing methodology and existing thinking, and really kind of coupling that with design sensibilities and more generative ways of applying research, so that we can be both thoughtful and deliberate about this, but also, Ian, you mentioned the word creativity, right? Being expansive about where we might find solutions and how we might actually sort of use this notion of reframing to think differently and to behave differently. So that's the behavioral piece is I think a really interesting sort of add-on to this and augmenting of what behavioral, what positive sum design can look like. And I would love to be able to, continue this conversation both with you three and with others as well, because this cross-disciplinary approach, I think, could be very exciting.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just to kind of, for those of you that may not be familiar with these terms, positive sum and zero sum. So just kind of over here, zero sum you can think of it as a win-lose situation, right? So there's a winner and a loser. The outcome is constrained, if you want to think of it that way. Positive sum means that the aggregate amount of value or the currency, as we've been talking about it, can exceed, can be as much as it needs to be. And so, this idea that our ethics are grounded in the way that we perceive the mutability of constraints, the way we think about these kinds of biases, tend to determine what's at stake and therefore how we kind of navigate and play these games. So, I don't know, where do you think we should start here? Do you want to talk, should we talk a little more about that, or do you have some other, Will, you had some questions as well, right? Or, I don't know. Vaughn?
Can we unmute Will?
I think, yeah, you will.
Okay, it looks like it likes to lock me out every time I mute myself. I think actually beginning with what you talked about, Ian, is great, and then we can, I have some questions we can all talk about. I also, there's we can start thinking about examples of positive sum systems and maybe bring some of the audience in. But I think sort of talking a little bit about mutability of constraints, and I love how you talk about how your ethics are sort of based in how you understand those possibilities, and sort of digging into that would be a good place to start.
Yeah. So we've talked about kind of the conditions of possibilities. Another thing we talked about, and it kind of aligns with what Ruth has been talking about choice infrastructure and just infrastructure in general. Like what's possible within a given situation, and not taking that for granted, and understanding that those are design decisions that come into play there, and that they affect what the outcomes are. So I'm wondering if that's a place we might want to start in terms of talking about how that the question of how that manifests itself in different kinds of value and meaning that can come out of a situation. So for example, one of the things we can think about in terms of positive sum outcomes is that it's not necessarily just competing. The metaphor that's often used is the pie, right? For a zero-sum game, that there's a finite amount of pie, and if I get a bigger slice, that means that you have to get a smaller slice. But already we've kind of constrained the way that things that those stakes have been established. What's those conditions of possibility? And it goes back to what we were talking about before about thinking about why do we want what we want in that particular situation. So if we reframe the question from I want the biggest piece of pie to I want dessert, you can start to think about other options, options like fruit, maybe that's more healthy, or coffee that will keep you awake after a long meal. There's other ways of thinking about it, and where that kind of, those constraints produce a sense of scarcity. By creatively reframing that question, as designers often do, you're able to expand the pie, so to speak. So we've also talked a little bit about the way that just the act of kind of these kinds of collaborations or these communities of trust, there's kind of positive externalities that emerge from that, which also add value to the way that these things play out. So there's a variety of ways that designers and stakeholders can kind of collect this value and can think about how they're expanding what they want to get out of a particular situation, and the way that designers, as kind of the people that are kind of orchestrating or kind of setting up these systems, can create more affordances for trust, for communication, for other ways of being able to negotiate what's at stake in a particular way. So I guess the question I'm kind of trying to set up here is that how as designers, and I'm using that term very broadly, you know, I mean, everybody that's in this room is a designer in terms of the way that I'm using the term, but how can designers set up situations that get people to see value in this more expansive way, to see constraints in a broader way and not get fixed in that kind of zero-sum bias? I don't know if that's too broad of a question, or if we want to kind of narrow it a little bit, but that might be a good place to start.
If I can just maybe build on that and expand
Please.
on it a little bit, and then we can sort of cycle out. So I think what you're describing is so key, and what all of us really just touched on in different ways is this sense of what people value, right? So this sense that the underlying assumption that everyone wants the same thing or that we all value the same thing is kind of a fallacy. Like that's not even true at its face. But also, and we've kind of talked about this in different ways too, sometimes what we say we want is almost a stand-in for something else. So if, for example, you know, I say I want a promotion, I want a higher title, I want to be a director or a vice president or whatever, maybe I want those things, but maybe what I actually want is to be recognized for my expertise. Maybe what I really want is to feel like I have a voice in the room and I am a decision maker. And those things may not actually equate to a promotion or to a title. And we can actually, you know, sometimes each of us individually sometimes can pursue things that we think we want, but we don't actually want. Like maybe that promotion brings with it a whole slew of other stuff, which is just a pain in the butt and actually not worth it. But it's almost like I think as designers, since in the human-centered world, at least, certainly like understanding what people want is a key part of this. I can't help but think that I think part of what you're touching on, Ian, is also this idea of how do we genuinely start to understand what system values are, but also how to understand more deeply what people actually think they want, or the difference between maybe what they say and sort of what are ways, for example, that things like respect, hopefully, are infinite, right? That's not like a zero-sum game by itself. So that reframing on multiple levels just feels like a really key part of what you were describing, and I just wanted to kind of yank that out a little bit more.
So there's a couple things that, oh, sorry, go ahead. There's a couple things.
Go ahead, Arthur.
Sorry, well, there's a couple things that jumped to mind here. And I'll try to keep it brief. So I was thinking about the education example again, and what you were saying, Ian, and what you were saying, Ruth, is, you know, like how do we know what people actually want? And so in education, one of the things that is a sort of constant struggle or question is who is the central stakeholder in the educational ecosystem? So I'm gonna get to like what we want in a moment. So if the student is the center of the educational ecosystem and we are thinking about what a student wants or needs, then we might be thinking about student success. Well, the ways that we measure student success often are on variables that we can look at after the fact. So things like grades or behavior or attendance or sort of proxy variables for student success. But to Ruth's point, what a student might actually want is to learn, to understand, to feel that they have more control, to feel that they're supported, to feel that they have the things that they need in the places that they need them. And so in that world, what a student is looking for has nothing to do with their grades and has nothing to do with their behavior or their suspension. And so we have to think about what the student wants in a little bit of a different way. And I think this is where the designer's role can be so critical, because what we're able to do is to understand people, to listen to them, to elicit what their needs really are, their needs, their attributes, their values, their pain points, their motivations, in order to better serve them. So in the educational ecosystem, so if we frame the game as students are at the center, and there's a scarcity of resources available for students, then the people that are supporting the students, the in-school folks, the out-of-school folks, part of what they are looking for, to Ruth's point, may be credit. So if the student does better, this person or that person wants the credit for being the person or the entity or the organization that helped to support student outcomes. But what if we said, that's not, so credit may be what you want, students may want to be understood and heard. What if we reframe this whole thing in a different way and say, what we are looking for is the health of the overall ecosystem. So not student outcomes, not provider philanthropic dollars or credit, but the overall health of the community, of the school, of the family, of the neighborhoods. And if you look at that as a central need or what you're trying to serve in the ecosystem, then scarcity doesn't come into play in the same way as it does when you're thinking about resources. Because network effects, social capital, values, respect, responsibility, the feeling of being heard, the feeling of being needed, these are things that can happen in a positive sum way. They are not zero-sum goods. I can feel needed, you can feel needed, we can all feel respected, and that doesn't cost anybody anything. And so what we're trying to do in the educational ecosystem is to better understand what people really want, to reframe the game with different stakeholders at the center and different needs prioritized in order to try to shift from that zero-sum bias to a positive-sum way of thinking. So it's about not only changing the central stakeholder, but examining and interrogating what is the value that the system is actually delivering to people. Is it grades? Is it behavior? Is it overall health? Like, what are we trying to do? And if we define these things appropriately, or if we, as designers, are able to elucidate from our constituents what they are really after, perhaps we can find ways to make it so systems can serve everybody rather than serving the thing that's, about compliance or money or whatever else. I don't know if I really answered the question or not, but I tried to.
No, that was great. That was...
They're actually, Will, go ahead.
Will,
It's
please.
your turn.
Okay. I just wanted to sort of underscore a point that both of you made sort of in different ways, which is if there's anything, well, to step back a little bit, we talk about this idea of value or like experienced value a lot, and we've been throwing that word around a lot. And then we've been talking about types of values, say like feeling respected, feeling valued, well, feeling valued. And if there's any sort of like central, posture or stance to positive sum design, I think this would be it, or one of them. There's probably several, which is this idea that value as a sustainable, or as a subjective thing, is really it's a beginning of infinity, as David Deutsch would say. It's like something that as designers, we like, you could think of our job as to try and unlock this thing that we can really just like have infinite amounts of. And there are things in the world that are finite and zero sum. Things like water or air or like sort of measurable, physical, tangible assets. But because value is so subjective, you can really you can unlock infinite amounts of it. And by switching that posture and thinking about, okay, where is the value that we can unlock in this situation, I think one opens oneself up to a stance where it becomes much easier to think about those positive sum outcomes. And so I just wanted to sort of make that explicit, because everybody I think is sort of talking about that in one way or another.
And maybe this is just adding one additional layer, and then I'll throw it back. But what's interesting, both of you, Will and Arti, just now used the word measurable, and this is bringing it back to the behavioral thing. We as human beings, doesn't matter who you are, we love to be able to compare things. Like, that is sort of this undeniable human trait. We're really happy when we're able to say that one thing is better than another. It is one of the reasons why, and I'm not saying that's a great attribute, but it's like we have this tendency just as human beings. And it is one of the reasons why things like tangible value, things that are very easy to measure and capture, tend to win out, because there are things that can allow us to rank and say, like, you're in the top 10%, you're in the next 20%. I used to work for a big innovation firm, and things like sales were really respected, and things like mentorship. I'm not saying it was disposable, but it's a hell of a lot harder to measure mentorship than it is to measure sales. And you know what? Performance management systems every year really cared about sales quite a bit, because they could actually sort of say, like, did you meet your requirements? Did you exceed, et cetera? So that notion of, it may be one of the things as we think about opportunities for expanding, how positive sum is accepted. I think one of the interesting constraints that we'll continue to come up against is that sense of how can you, even if somebody individually cares a lot about things like respect and value, which are more intangible. From sort of a more sort of external perspective, it's really hard to not get yanked back into that sense of what's measurable, what's comparable, who wins. So that's going to be like a consistent tension, I suspect, that I hadn't really like gotten my head around until you all were just saying that.
And I think as designers, I think what part of the trick is, how do you design affordances for these things? Things like trust, right?
Mm-hmm.
One example that we've talked about, is like the sharing economy, and like something like Uber. You can say a lot of things about the labor practices and so forth, but one of the things that's really interesting about that kind of technology is it's created an affordance for trust, right? You're getting into a stranger's car, essentially, right? And so there are examples of ways that designers can create these systems that help to kind of build affordances for trust, for communication, for collaboration, that have all these other kinds of externalities that kind of emerge from them as well. I think another aspect of this is, kind of looking at, kind of some design practices such as human-centered design or humanity-centered design, where there's an emphasis on kind of empathizing with the user, with the human in that situation, and trying to really find these ways of communicating, creating trust, to be able to find these new kinds of values that we're talking about. It's almost like mining the situation to find the opportunities that you wouldn't see as a single individual, but leveraging the network of people, the stakeholders that are involved in such a way that you discover that there's more for everybody. And so as designers, we can kind of build these things into the systems and into the objects, into the experiences that we're creating for users and user groups. I don't know if that takes that a little bit further, or if that's worth exploring a little bit further.
I'm wondering if, I really think that example of things like ride sharing, or like way back, I feel like couch surfing was maybe one of the early versions of like the internet allowed for scale, but trust underlaid the reason why people were willing to do that. And then now you have like Airbnb, Uber, things like that. I'm wondering if we can maybe hone in. There's something really interesting about that, because the tendencies to distrust others that we don't know is, again, like kind of a normal kinship related deal. Like how, I'm wondering, like from the rest of y'all, how can that be, I'm gonna say, engineered or supported? Like how can that kind of trust be part of it? Because I think that's essential, right? The idea that you're willing to potentially give up more gains for yourself, and you're willing to give up to the greater good, is, trust is a big part of that. I'm just wondering if, there are kinds of examples, like how do we start to cultivate a perspective on
But also giving it up in such a way that you know that in the long term you're getting more, and it's not the kind of short term.
Giving up concrete short-term stuff for long-term is hard. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think some part of that has to do with like engineered transparency. So this is something we talk about a lot in like the design of interactive services, is when do you want to be transparent, and how transparent do you want to be? And so sometimes, and there's sort of a bias that we should be fully transparent about everything all the time. And that doesn't necessarily always work, because not everybody needs to know everything about everything all the time. At the same time, we don't want to govern information in a way that makes it hard for people to know what they need to when they need to know. And services like Uber or Airbnb, they use transparency to inspire trust. So what they do, and so I mean, you can think about the example of Uber. Why would a parent let their kid get into a car with a stranger to drive them home? Well, they can track them on the thing. They know who the person was. They know where they're going. They're the ones controlling the payment. They can literally watch the car go from one place to another. So in this situation where, if you framed the game in the way that was purely zero sum, kid needs to go from point A to point B, the only way to do that is to pay somebody to do that, that's not necessarily positive, because a parent may not be able to be there, they may need to sacrifice their own time to do something, whatever it happens to be. But in this circumstance, designers have created a situation where they have increased transparency, they've built an interactive system that basically lets parents be, or people be, in two places at the same time in order to build trust into a system where there is inherently perhaps not trust built in. And so I think that there's something in there, and technology gives us the ability to do it, where we can we can provide incredible amounts of transparency and clarity into previously ambiguous or hard to measure or hard to describe things. And that gives us a sense of trust, it gives us a sense of comfort, it gives us a sense of confidence, because there are things that before would have been ambiguous and unknown and perhaps frightening or scary that now we know, and by removing that ambiguity and increasing transparency, we increase trust. But I think we have to do it in such a way that is still governable. Because if you just blanket open up everything and you make it totally transparent, you can actually harm safety and security. So there's like a balance between transparency and security and transparency and safety in a circumstance like this one. I think in other types of positive sum types of frames, it's a little bit different, where maybe transparency is not the way to gain trust. So I'm thinking about like the community of trust example. In this one, it was about information availability and information access. Many systems, people don't trust each other because they believe that there is asymmetrical information built into the system. And one of the things that we can do as designers is to remove or to reduce asymmetrical information where possible, where it actually can improve outcomes for all of the members of that particular ecosystem. And so that's another way of reframing a zero-sum game, which perhaps benefits, or one or the other member of the game benefits from the asymmetrical information. By changing that, by providing everybody with more information, more transparency, more access to that information, it actually, instead of doing the thing in education or in social services where by letting everybody have access to the information, everybody can share credit, it actually enables everybody to provide better services. So you're not sharing information and making it harder to do services, you're sharing information for everybody to actually improve their service delivery. So what starts out as asymmetric information that is creating positive rewards for one or other member of the system, when you can change that overall information ecosystem, you could actually create an ecosystem where you have more positive rewards for everybody because you have removed that asymmetrical information, which is, it's sort of it runs counter to some conventional thinking, but I think that's exactly what we're trying to do here, is to say conventional thinking would prioritize or presuppose that this bias towards asymmetrical information that benefits one or another party is better, but perhaps certain systems actually would benefit from that not existing in that same way.
And just building upon that, something we've discussed in our past conversation is thinking about education and knowledge as being both non-rival and non-excludable goods.
Right.
So what we mean by that is that a rival good is a good that if you consume it, somebody else can't consume it. A non-rival good is many people can consume it. It has no additional or very little marginal cost. So maybe an example of that might be a digital file that's a song or something like that. It has no extra marginal cost to, or very little marginal cost to be able to distribute that to however many people you want to. However, there are oftentimes artificial kinds of limits or constraints that are imposed that make it excludable, so that some people, you sign up for Spotify, you pay for it, and people that pay for it can listen to that music, and people that don't are excluded from that, right? And there are lots of examples. I'm thinking that's one of the ways that we can think about how we, about the mutability constraints in terms of rival, non-rival, even anti-rival, which is the idea that the more people that use something, the more value it has, like a social network, for example. So this idea that we can kind of expand the pie, so to speak, through the reframing of rivalry and non-rivalry and excludability, non-excludability, but education and knowledge being kind of the examples par excellence of a good, if you want to think of it that way, of a value, of a currency that doesn't diminish over being distributed over many people. In fact, it's anti-rival in the sense that you gain more. Wikipedia is the example that we often talk about because it works for the same reason. It's the more people that contribute to it, the more people that discuss it, the more people that are involved, the more knowledge that's produced and can be shared, and it's a positive sum benefit for everybody. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
It just made me think of AR, so go ahead.
Will, were you going to say something?
Oh no, I was glad you added the anti-rival in there, because that's a really important positive sum effect is when you have, it's not only the pie, like you're not just splitting the pie, but the more people who try to eat the pie, actually the bigger the pie gets. It's a pretty great situation to be in. And that's sort of people say that and it sounds crazy, but it is the way so much of the world works. And it's like important, I think, as positive sum design practitioners, people thinking about design for a positive way, to really try and wrap your head around that like there are systems that you can make where the pie gets bigger as more people try to eat it.
So I have a couple of like sort of things that just jumped into my mind, counter examples, or maybe these are ones to throw out to the audience. So two things came to mind. One is AI. And so AI could be a system where the more people that use it, the better it gets. But perhaps, is that good or is that not good? So I think that's a sort of separate question. Is this what we want? Is this the value that is the beneficial value? But it is, I think, a good example of positive sum. And then the other one is, and this is an example that's come up in my class a lot recently, it has to do with dark patterns. But I'm thinking about, well, two things. Photo file sharing on the cloud, which was free, and the more people that used it, so more storage is being used, so in theory that costs more money. However, the secondary benefit of all of the free photo sharing is that it taught the machines how to recognize faces, how to do pattern matching, how to, do facial recognition. And so there are so the more people that use them, the more image libraries that are used in the public sphere, the better the services get at doing this type of detection. And is this what we want? And so these are, I think, a couple of circumstances where they're positive sum, but perhaps we need to think about the ethical outcomes and what happens in that ecosystem with this type of thing. So I think there's places where it's really great, and then there's places where perhaps we need some other things to kind of govern it, but just throwing those two things out.
Examples.
Well,
Yeah, or go ahead, Ruth. Sorry.
No, I was just, this may be going down a little too far down the AI rabbit hole, but that does unpack a whole lot of really interesting questions, because there's also, the whole sort of connected set of issues in terms of what algorithms are learning from, and even like, Will, you're using the term posture, which I like a lot and use a lot in terms of how people even perceive what choices are. So, for example, I was at a lecture a number of years ago, and somebody was talking about how great it would be if there was some algorithm that could keep him from browsing the web when he needed to be doing work or something along those lines. And I remember thinking at the time, like, oh yeah, I could see how some people might find that really appealing, and like you could imagine, training a system that sort of, makes that easier for folks in one direction. On the other hand, you have folks who think that AI, is like monitoring or surveilling them, and they're actually at the, on the receiving end of not so great services as a result of that. So, I'm not an AI expert, but I do think like when we start to think about technology's role in this larger set of positive sum outcomes, because that is likely to be, right, technology is absolutely important. I'm not saying like it's good to be a Luddite about it, but it opens up some really interesting questions, and I think those the thing about ethics and equity is getting mentioned quite a bit here too, which seems a really essential thing to be asking, because if we're talking about designing at a systems level, whether it's algorithmic or not, that becomes a hugely important consideration.
Just to kind of build upon that, something else we've talked about, and I think we're still struggling with it a little bit, is kind of when we're thinking about value, about absolute value and relative value, and the question of inequality, right? So like, on the one hand, if I see you gain something, there's kind of an instinct that I want that, right? That's kind of part of that zero-sum bias. There's that study with the monkeys, right? That where one gets the grape and sees the other monkey get it. I don't know if anybody's seen this. The other monkey gets cucumber. The monkey that got cucumbers gets really mad at the monkey that got the grape, right? It's something that's very kind of built in, right? If you see somebody get something, you want that as well, right? And that somehow, in ways that we probably should articulate further, is part of that zero-sum bias, right? We've also talked about, absolute value and the kind of aggregate value where maybe not everybody is gaining equally, but that there's, all boats float, so to speak, right? To use the common phrase. So like, and kind of trying to figure out how we sit with that, and kind of, and yes, you can create these positive sum situations, but if, one person is getting, a very, very minute amount of that value and somebody's getting a great deal of it, that's a problem as well. So, you know, we're trying to kind of navigate that a little bit, and also think about the ways that positive sum design doesn't necessarily have to come out of these collaborative or kind of idealistic ideas about collaboration, right? There can be competition, that there can be this kind of ways of kind of agonistic is the term we're using. This idea that where you have different positions and different ways of thinking about things, but in the conversation itself, in the dialectic, something new emerges which benefits everybody. And so I think these are all kind of live questions that we've been talking about as well, and I don't know if we have good resolutions for some of those questions, but it's something we're recognized as something of a problem or a question that needs to be addressed in some way as we think about how we build value for everybody. How is that distributed? How is that equitable? Is equitable? And I guess the bigger question is equity the right ethical framework to think about these things? If you're thinking about the mutability of constraints, is it, you know, is that based on a kind of framework that always already has this kind of scarcity built into it? And if you take that scarcity away and you can find more ways of addressing those needs, does it change the way we think about those kinds of ethical questions? And I think that's something we're struggling with a little bit. Yeah.
I'll also jump in here and say a few things. One, I'm fascinated by this question about competition and like at what level can one have zero-sum systems operating within larger positive sum systems and strengthening those positive sum systems. I think that's a really important question to think about. We all had a big discussion earlier in the week about sports, but there's all sorts of examples of this, and I think it's fascinating. And as you say, it's a live question, Ian. The other thing I would say is that, you know, this, as with I think most things, this is not an ethics-proof approach to design. If you are operating with a set of, say, antisocial ethics, you're going to be able to do antisocial things. If you with a mindset that creates a bunch of value, you could create a bunch of value in a really in a way that's very antisocial, if that's sort of what your ethic works at. And I have sensed to some degree in some of the design discourse this like need to, or this hope to find a set of like design approaches that are ethics proof. And whether or not that's possible, I'm kind of skeptical about it. Others might not be. But I think it's clear that you can create positive sum value and then use it to, like in Arthi's example with the photo sharing, right? You can use it to really tremendous gain, but also you could use it for, surveillance and surveilling people who don't want to be surveilled. And so there's, one has to be sensitive to that and be thoughtful about that on a personal level as a designer, I think. And we'll continue to struggle with this, and personally and as a profession, and I think that's a good thing. I think that's healthy.
Should we open it up to the audience? What questions or thoughts, or how can we take this further? We'd love to hear your thinking on this. Yeah.
Thanks.
Can you just tell us what your name is? And
yeah, my name's Alex. One thing that you all mentioned in thinking about trust and accountability, especially in the examples of things like Uber and Airbnb, would you all say that trust kind of requires a specific third party that can be held accountable? Because it seems like the case of Uber and Airbnb, it's like, if you kidnap my child, I can sue you. Like, that's what generates the trust, right? And so in thinking where there isn't, in situations where there may not be that third party, right, where it's just maybe that third party is just culture or, I don't know, court or whatever, you know what I mean? How then can trust be generated when there's no guarantee that there's recourse if something goes wrong?
it's a great
It's a
question.
great question. Yeah. So I
Well,
think.
I can maybe,
Yeah.
no,
So, I mean, so I come from a policy background, and when we are dealing with human relationships and human trust, I think that, so the external ability to govern the situation, so that could be like a legal or like Uber or suing or lawsuits, those provide kind of an after the fact ability to solve for the trust problem. But I think that for something like an Uber or any of these sort of situations where it's happening in real time, it's the real time ability to watch something, I think, that gives you trust. Like, at least for me personally, and perhaps other people are different, the ability to exercise like retributive justice, or something goes wrong and I have to fix the thing that goes wrong through the system, that to me is an ability to solve a problem after it's happened, and I don't know that that actually promotes trust. I think that promotes a sense of responsibility or accountability, but I think trust, at least in my view, happens before and has a bit more to do with, and that's why I was talking about transparency and the ability to see something happening in real time. The other thing from a policy perspective is in human relationships, especially in our modern context, there's almost always a regulatory or a legal framework within which we're operating. Even if there's not like an official third party, commercialized third party, there is generally either an implicit or an explicit social contract or actual contract that we are, or system that we're operating within. And so that system provides some of that structure that we need to build trust. But is your name Alex? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Alex, I think the other side of what you brought up is a critical problem that we have right now in general, and this has to do, I think, with like things like misinformation and like who is that third party. So I think part of the problem we have now is the reason that we don't trust institutions is we don't know who the institution actually is. So in the case of an Uber, there's a legal department at Uber, and if something goes wrong, you can sue the legal department. But when you're thinking about like trusting information that you might see in a social network or even on a news feed, the entity that you're trusting is a little bit different because it's a person, it's a human entity, as opposed to a corporate protected legal entity. And so I think part of what we have now in our society is a systemic lack of trust in our institutions, because we don't really know anymore who our institutions are or how we are supposed to work with them. I think fundamentally something has happened to the social contract that we have with our institutions that has made it so that we don't fundamentally trust them in the same way as we used to. I don't know if that's social media, I don't know if it's anonymity online, I don't know if it's new platforms, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but there is something like the de-identification of the entity or of the person seems to exacerbate a sense or a lack of trust within ecosystems. And that's something I don't know how to solve.
I think that's totally on point. I think that there is this kind of lack of trust in institutions and in government. I mean, everybody used to think it was going to be like the government that kind of takes your privacy away, where it's really like these corporations, right? It's these other kinds of third parties. But what's really interesting about what's emerging with things like blockchain, for example, where you're taking out that kind of institutional component and essentially, I mean, you're creating an affordance for trust that way, that you can't, double spend money or whatever, in terms of, the way that currency could work. You could start to imagine the way that something like blockchain, like, could you build an Uber around a blockchain, for example, so that you feel comfortable getting into somebody's car? Those are the kinds of design questions that could be really interesting to kind of navigate around some of this kind of loss of faith or loss of trust in these institutions. And I don't know if new institutions would emerge out of that. I don't know if it would be more equitable. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the consequences of that would be, but it's interesting to kind of consider this kind of non-third party affordance for trust. It's a really interesting question that you bring up.
With the blockchain and like editability, I think part of it, you mentioned accountability. I think the other thing is also authentication. So it's very hard to authenticate who anybody is anymore. And so the idea of accountability in an entity when you are unable to authenticate and people are able to edit is a problem that blockchain actually could solve for. Because if you have a stable ledger that's non-editable in the traditional ways, then you don't necessarily need to know like the authentic, like who did the changes, but you can see the ledger and the change. So it's like a little bit of a different way to create trust that is sort of anonymized and deinstitutionalized.
And think of the ways that you could kind of avoid like the rent seeking that you get in like Uber, for example. You know, the billion-dollar companies that are facilitating this trust, right? If there was a way to design these affordances where it's directly between the parties, I mean, that seems like there's a lot of value that could be captured there that doesn't just go to, you know, big corporations or whatever. I think that's a very interesting set of questions to consider. Ruth, what were you going to say? I'm sorry to kind of cut you off.
Yeah, no, I first of all, I would agree with, you know, lots of what y'all are saying. I think that maybe the other thing that's interesting, Arthi sort of mentioned this too, that the trust in larger institutions has diminished, and has even turned into skepticism. It's not even neutral anymore. It's actually like genuinely skeptic. But also just it's interesting how that notion of trust has changed over time, right? Where it's, when we talk about trust, the sense that it's some unilateral thing is sort of not true anyway. And I'm not saying anything that people don't already sort of think about and know. But you know, when it used to be, like technology absolutely has amplified that. So the fact that there is a lot of, it's increased in some ways the ability to trust on a broader scale. Like when Airbnb, Uber, et cetera, all these things could not exist without technology as a means to connect. But buying into that system also means buying into that sense of trust. But even like on a person-to-person basis, right? Like when we start to get trained out of how to trust larger institutions, it also I think bleeds into how we think about individuals. And yet social norms are in a sense like this informal trust contract that we all have about how to operate that we don't even think about. Like trust is just operating on so many different types of levels. There are kind of more formal and explicit mechanisms for it. And accountability, like Alex, you know, you use the term like very specifically in terms of being able to sue somebody, right? Like that's one form of lack of trust or accountability, but we're also swimming in so many different levels of it throughout that I think it actually has very significant implications on, you know, thinking about where we're solving for systems, like where does trust exist? Because even organizations are different, right? Like if we're thinking about something which is a total kind of free market, that's one kind of thing. If it's very much kind of an identity-driven or a kinship-driven set of individuals where there's this implicit social contract, like where we have each other's backs, that's a different one. So I think it's a really interesting and important question, and there is absolutely not a simple answer because the question itself is operating at a variety of levels, I think.
I'll also add something there. You just made this pop into my mind, Ruth. There's also this idea, you know, in positive sum design, when things go right, you end up finding a solution where things improve for everybody in the system. And so one of the ways that can engender trust is that you can sort of trust people in this sense to look out for themselves. And by taking part in the system, like by design, taking part in the system is beneficial to you because of the positive sum aspects of it. And so in that way, positive sum design can also sort of create these frameworks for trust because you can trust folks to almost look out for themselves.
Actually, can I just add one more thing that popped
Yeah.
into my head based on what you just said? And this again is like going back to behavioral theory, because there have been lots and lots of studies that show that present tense concrete stuff outweighs future tense abstract stuff. Like it's one of the core reasons, right? Like we don't exercise, we don't eat right, we don't save for retirement. Like you could name it in 1,000 different areas where our immediate gains tend to get more of our attention and effort and energy than our longer term ones. So in a way, and Will, what you just said made it sort of clear to me too, it's like to some extent investing in positive sum outcomes if you're a participant is also trusting that it's going to pay off. Like that's actually not an easy thing, right? That's kind of a bet you're making. And that's a sort of challenging bet given how much people like to sort of feel concretely like they're getting something. So that's just an underlying dynamic that I think we need to be considering.
So what you just brought to mind for me was risk tolerance. So when you think about zero sum versus positive sum, zero sum has a sort of prioritizes risk mitigation, right? Because if you believe that I'm going to win and for me to win you have to lose, then you're going to work to mitigate your risk, whereas if it's positive sum and everybody can win, then it sort of requires a different risk profile. You have to trust the system that you're all going to win, and that your desire for risk, you probably have to increase your ability to tolerate risk so that you can actually get a greater reward. But it seems that it just sort of changes that risk profile and how people think about benefits and cost and risk versus reward, the definition of reward in general.
Other questions or comments? Yeah. Yeah, Jessica. Can you maybe walk up here a little bit closer so we can get your voice on the mic? Is that be too much to ask? Sorry.
I was like, I could be loud from here.
We just want to make sure we hear you.
Okay, so my question was very much, I'm still thinking about what you said in terms of it's easier to measure sales than it is to measure mentorship, and I think this like kind of relates to this conversation about building trust too, because I think like in buying into making changes towards like positive sum design on like the systemic level, it kind of to me requires like people buying in, which I think to get people to buy in or believe in something, sometimes it requires metrics or measurements. And so I was interested in hearing more thoughts on how you might go about measuring these like important but difficult to measure things like mentorship or building relationships, with the context of like what would that even mean? Because I don't think I mean like building relationships in terms of like, oh, we're friends on Facebook, but in these like complex, to me like very like foundational things to a more like functional, collaborative, positive sum way of working in systems. This is my question.
I can take a little bit of a first stab at that, but I would love to hear what everyone else thinks too. No, that sense of, I mean, what I said I think is true. Like things that are easy to compare, measure, we have a tendency towards that, but absolutely there is this sense of evidence that it feels like things that we can measure, we can then prove. Like there's a reason that, data-driven and evidence-driven medicine, for example, evidence-driven policy, like there is trust that gets implicit in that. On the other hand, I think we all also recognize, right, that you can kind of game the system. So things that are measurable doesn't mean they're the right things or the most meaningful things. Or then you often get that sense of like, teaching to the test kind of idea where like, oh, that's the thing that's measurable. There's a quote, what is it? I think it's Campbell's Law. I may be misquoting it, but basically like as soon as you set a measure for goals, and you basically like kiboshed the value of it. And that's like, it becomes this magnet that attracts behavior that it should. So that balance of sort of what counts as evidence, what counts as sort of believability is really interesting. And I personally am like obsessed with the idea of intangible value and how do we capture that and measure it, or at least conceive of it in a way that's useful and important. The value of things that don't happen. Is there a way to even think about that, right? If we're talking about positive sum and this notion of long-term abstract situations or outcomes, is there a way to measure the could have been that actually would have been better, right? Like there are ways that we can start to think about that. But I also just wanted to introduce maybe a reframe that I've found useful at least, because we can often end up sort of falling back on these terms, quantitative and qualitative, as two different ways of thinking about evidence or value. And I've taken to preferring the terms evidence of something, which is like there's evidence of something having happened. Like I can measure that, it's a little bit more past tense in a way. And then I think a design-minded way in the sense of looking at evidence is evidence for something. Like what suggests that could be true? It's like that sense of plausibility rather than probability. That can be helpful too. So in terms of how to think about that, I think we are coming up against multiple things. There is this tendency to like to measure stuff. It's nice to rank and rate stuff. It's actually also, if you're at the top of the heap, it's really nice to kind of stay that way, like school rankings and ratings and grades, like all of these things, they are there for a reason, is that if you attain something, it's sort of nice to feel like you've gotten, the props for it. But I do think, maybe as we think about what is valuable and how to capture it, capturing is not the same as measuring, right? So thinking about like what it could be suggesting, and I think new mechanisms, maybe this is part of the role of new design tools and methods, right? How do we better capture the possibility of something useful happening, or the possibility and plausibility of positive benefits for all that feels real and feels concrete in a way that data kind of has this advantage right now. But I think that is something that methodology can, that's not the only way.
I think Jessica's question is so deep and rich for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, what's more valuable than relationships in a sense, right? It's between your family, between your friends, professional relationships, your network, right? And yet, as we're discovering, there's not a way of capturing that value, a quantitative way, even maybe a capitalist way of kind of capturing those things in the same way that we can measure other things. And maybe there shouldn't be. I don't know. But what's interesting about that? I mean, so there's this kind of critique, of like the commodity fetish, for example, where the social relationship, the labor that goes into something is obscured by the object itself. It's like we have this kind of bias towards kind of this measuring and reducing these relationships to things and to these kinds of, to money and things like that, right? And so I'm a little bit hesitant to try to even measure it in the same kinds of ways, and maybe we need new ways of thinking about how we exchange that value so that that kind of social currency can be integrated in these conversations in a different way. And I just think it's just coming from the question that Jessica asked. It's fascinating that there aren't more ways or more obvious ways of doing that. For something that seems so fundamental and maybe the most important thing, the most important value that we have is our relationships with other people, and yet we don't think about it in those same kinds of terms. I mean, this is all, I'm just kind of thinking through your question, but it just seems like that's a very important point in terms of how we capture some of these positive externalities through these kinds of through this kind of new kinds of ways to think about social currency and network effects and all the other things we've been talking about. Just some general thoughts there that are worth exploring.
So kind of to piggyback on what both of you were saying. So one thing we talk about in my class a lot, because we talk a little bit about a concept called the end game, in particular when you're thinking about things like starting a nonprofit or a philanthropy or a social benefit type of entity. And what often happens in those cases is it's hard to measure anything in a way that's going to give like a funder or an external party the ability to know that it's working. So in the same way, and so when you think about things like credit versus relationships, like things that are, as we've been describing, quantifiable, are easier to report to somebody else. And so what we often talk about in class is how do we measure ambiguous progress? And I think that's like akin to what we're talking about here, where there are things that we can measure that we can count, but then there's things that we can measure or that we can observe that perhaps need other ways of representing them so that we can show what they actually are. And so by that I mean, when we think about relationships or networks, you could count the number of people in your LinkedIn friends group. You could also count the number of interactions, the number of logins. So there's all these like counting metrics that we can do that can give us passive information about what's happening. So what I've often encouraged students to do is expand the definitions of variables that you can measure or that you can count. Look at qualitative variables, look at survey variables, look at self-report variables, which traditionally in like social science, we don't value those as much, or in science, like self-reported variables, these are not as important as things that we can measure externally. However, when we're talking about things like relationships or trust or networks, sometimes the self-report is actually quite important, and I think that there are things that we could borrow from anthropology or ethnography or the sociology that may help us to quantify things or qualify things that are difficult to measure in traditional ways by sort of expanding our definitions of what those metrics might look like. So in like funding and those types of things, we often encourage folks to look at passive variables or proxy variables that you can look at that might represent the underlying thing that you're actually looking for. What those might be will vary from one situation to another, but I would start to look there for like, what are the proxies? What are the other things that you can measure? Are there, like in design, we look at things like trace, like could you observe someone's environment and look at trace to see the effects of what they're doing in a way that you wouldn't be able to measure in some other way.
Actually, can I get onto that maybe, or just build on that a little bit? Because some of the work that I have been doing separately from this project is related to, this is going to sound super dry and boring, apologies, scholarly research assessment. Like, how do we move away from things like citations or H-index, or there are these kind of well-known, highly quantifiable, but also kind of suspect sort of number of games that academics use to say, like, I'm, worth the promotion or tenure or whatnot. So, I'm being very, very dismissive about them. They serve certain purposes, but they're way overused. And there's been this increasing effort lately to do exactly, Arthi, what you're kind of describing, which is thinking in terms of, for example, what are contextual issues that we need to understand in order to genuinely sort of, recognize what value looks like or what impact somebody has made. Because part of it, for example, if you're starting from different starting points, or, somebody may have taken a non-traditional path, that is a really important contextual consideration. So it's not just about what's countable, but it's also like, what is the context in which we're doing that counting? And then another thing that just came to mind, and I know, especially in the social sciences, like anecdotes are frowned upon, right? Because that's like an N1, where it's like, oh, well, I just heard this like offhand thing, how can that count for anything? But on the other hand, narratives have a very, very strong, very important role, where it'll make sense of things, and it allows us to not just tell stories, but to kind of, again, contextualize and understand an arc and a trajectory and sort of the human behind things. So there's, again, it's not necessarily trying to quantify a narrative, but they're thinking about what can augment what, those natural tendencies towards quantifying things. What is the context? What are the stories underlying it? Sort of thinking about a more multidimensional way of considering and capturing. Again, capturing maybe more than measuring what matters. It's an interesting challenge, and I'm looking at it in a very kind of niche area, but I think it's very relevant to this conversation.
I think that's such an important point. I think it also suggests perhaps the way that art, poetry, and storytelling can be more, have more validation in terms of how we think about these things. Like, how do you measure meeting the love of your life, or meeting your firstborn child, or these kinds of relationships, right? That aren't easily quantifiable. It's even ridiculous to kind of quantify them or to try to place them in that kind of context. That there's a language, a broader, a deeper language that's required to really fully make sense of those kinds of relationships. And if you don't have that, that gets these important relationships and these important experiences are left out of that. And I think that this also goes to what we were talking about finding new currencies and new ways of measuring these currencies. And I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that, one of the things that we're basing this kind of measurement on is a very kind of science-based approach to data and to these kinds of measurements. So we tend to emphasize quantitative data feels very real, and these kinds of like anecdotal evidence is kind of a little bit less real. And I think that in addition to that kind of scientific basis for how we measure things, we also have to look at the arts. We have to look at the ways that we, this broader sense of creativity that I was kind of alluding to at the beginning, and thinking about how we find value and meaning in those things, and how that value and meaning can be exchanged in a broader way, and how that value and meaning is part of what creates these positive sum effects. I don't have the full answer to that, but I feel like that has to be part of that equation in some way.
Yeah, so something that it goes back a little bit to what Alex was asking about, and then I think it ties in, what's your name, Jessica?
Yeah.
What you're asking about as well, and then what you're, it has a little bit to do with sales and a little bit to do with trust. And so I was thinking about, so I work a lot on educational interfaces for college planning types and assessment types of companies. And so when schools and districts decide to buy something, they're going to look at all the data. They're going to look at the outcome data, year-over-year growth, and all this other stuff. But when they make the decision, the thing that we have now had to start to add to websites and to add to all of the material is the voice of the actual person who's going to use the product and what their story is, and a 2-sentence quote from a teacher that has had a really positive impact based on some tool that they're using is in many ways more effective as a sales tool than a 25-page, like, properly researched gold standard study. Because no one's gonna read it. They're gonna look at the 3 graphics and they're gonna be like, great, 2.5 years of growth, that's what I'm looking for. But is this a tool I really wanna use? And if some teacher says, this has changed my life, I understand what's happening in my classroom, I'm happier, it's faster, it's easier, that is far more meaningful in a decision for somebody than 2.2 years of growth and 8 months of usage. It's just not that. So there's something about, and I think, Ian, this just goes to what you were saying, it's like there's, as humans, and Alex, maybe this goes to your question as well, as humans, we trust each other. And we saw it in like the COVID misinformation thing. The people that faced the most vaccine hesitancy were most impacted in their lives by the people that they trusted. Talking to their doctor, talking to their pharmacist, talking to the people that they trusted, that they believed because they knew them, was more impactful and made them trust in a way that all of the data from the CDC or WHO or FDA or whomever couldn't do that for them. So I think there's something in there. We are humans, we respond to stimulus in a little bit of a different way, and you know, we want to make everything data driven. Ruth, to your point, we want everything to be evidence based. However, the things that are most compelling for us as humans, the evidence that we are sometimes most moved by, is not numbers, it's people. And so I think that's a little bit of what we're trying to do here, is if you work in a zero-sum way, you reduce and you quantify and you sort of create currency and proxy value out of other things rather than looking at the intrinsic human value. And I think part of what positive sum is trying to do is to reframe from these external proxy currencies into something that is more internal facing, but also harder to measure. So I think that's a little bit of the tension. So we would like to, I think, come up with tools to help us to teach it, to systematize it, to repeat it, like repeatable processes, so we can do this not just once and one off, but fundamentally we're trying to take something that is like quantifiable currency and turn it into something else, I think. Yeah.
That's really well put.
Yeah. Yep.
So there's a little bit of talk about like the role of zero-sum bias in positive-sum bias design, but I'm interested in sort of how to reconcile positive-sum design in like a context, like a larger system, like here, that is very much zero-sum oriented, and like in like a very capitalist world, how to sort of like how to actually do this in practice. And like you were talking about it a little bit with like fundraising, and like you need to come up with more creative ways to like still demonstrate. And yeah, and I guess like in like a very practical way, like how do people like have the time and energy and like ability to design in a positive sum way when like it feels like everything's working against that?
Great question.
Yeah.
Could either Ian or
No, you guys, I stopped.
repeat the question? It was hard to hear some of the.
Yeah.
So I think the question, and correct me if I'm not getting this right, is in the context where everybody wants to play a zero-sum game, and that's the norm, how do you play these positive sum games? How do you reframe the game? How do you find that kind of value that we're talking about? Is that kind of along the lines of what you were saying?
Cool.
So I'll take like the funder example, so philanthropic and entrepreneurial and like, you know, people that are interested in paying for things. And one part of it is managing expectations, and the other part for me is leading with the data that you do have. So I like to start with, so in any circumstance that you're working in, it is probable or likely that there is a regulatory infrastructure in place, that there is a technological ecosystem in place, that there is a policy framework in place, that there are existing products or services or things that are already working in that ecosystem. Those are your available data. And so with a funder or with someone else, if you lead with what you know, then that gives you like a basis to start with. And then when you're working on ambiguous outcomes, and this happens a lot with philanthropic funding, is they want to know what's going to happen in 6 months, or what's going to happen in a year, or what's going to happen in 18 months, and you don't know the answers to that. But what you can tell them is what your intentions are and how you expect to be able to measure. Whether or not you can actually measure, different question. but what I like to do is lead with my expectation and my assumptions and where I intend to measure. Because, and by setting those expectations early, and I also like to put in milestones. Like, I'm gonna measure, like, one of the metrics we use all the time is usage. Nobody likes it, but we always have it. So if you're building anything that is any kind of, it's delivered in any way, you know how many people have picked it up, downloaded it, used it, whatever, for how many things you've printed that are no longer in your thing. So there are certain variables and certain ways to measure that you always have access to, but then to the question that Jessica had, like, how do you measure networks or how do you measure relationships? Those are things that I like to tell them what I want to do. We'd like to do a survey of recommending behavior. So oftentimes will somebody recommend this to somebody else? Is this a tool or service that they liked that worked for them, whatever it happens to be. So you might use like marketing type metrics and propose to the funder or the external entity, this is what we intend to do. This is how the game is framed now. This is what is currently measured. Our intended impact, our theory of change asserts that this is going to happen if we do X, Y, and Z, and this is how we intend to measure it. It's not quantifiable. We don't have the ability, we can't run a double-blind gold standard study on this because our N is 25. So instead, we're gonna do a series of contextual inquiry. We're gonna do a set of individual interviews. We're gonna do surveys. We're gonna do observational work to understand and see whether or not this thing is actually working or not working. Because the only way to fight, in my view, and perhaps you guys can, the only way to fight zero-sum bias and to use positive sum bias is to sort of fight with data. And that data may or may not be quantifiable, but people need to be effectively, in my view, convinced that this is a way that can work for them. And the way to do that is to demonstrate that it's actually happening. And so that's how we think about it. I think we used to talk about this in class all the time, kind of ad nauseum, where I'd be like, figure out ways to quantify the unquantifiable, figure out ways to measure the ambiguous, and to Ruth's point, where in traditional social science, interviews and self-report is really frowned upon. When you think about design and usability studies, in usability studies, you need an N of 8 people to identify what 60 or 80% or 85% of the usability errors in a system. So we don't need a large N to do certain types of work. And so I just encourage folks to find what you can, lead with the uncertainty of what you're doing and use that to manage expectations, because you're trying to give them some data and you're doing something that is counter to the norm. And so that's what I would start with. And if you have a great funder and you start that way, then they might give you some latitude. And if you don't, you're gonna find out right away. That's the other thing, was kind of leading with it and sort of managing the expectations, because if you have an organization that you're working with, a nonprofit, a funder, whomever, that really doesn't align. They're like, no, what I need is X, Y, and Z. At least at that moment, you can say, hey, that's not what I can give you. That's not how this is gonna go, and so perhaps we should just part ways now, rather than getting into a situation where you're not able to deliver on what you're trying to deliver. This simple act of doing that will oftentimes get you through the door. They'll say, you know what, if you're willing to make that caveat and to say that that this might not be the right fit, then actually probably you're really committed to this work, and let's figure out how to make it work. So, honesty, transparency, manage expectations, and that's what I would start with. Guys?
Something I'd also add on to that, maybe from a different side looking at that, is often zero-sum bias and sort of zero-sum systems or stories are really stories that people are telling themselves. And so it becomes a question of, one, figuring out what is the source of the zero-sum story that a stakeholder of whatever sort is telling themselves, and what sort of value are they trying to get out of the system. There's a really, the name of this gentleman is escaping me. They're a Harvard professor in, I think, the School of Urban Planning, and they do a lot of work in negotiation. And what they talk about is like talking to one party and talking to the other, and actually trying to dig down into, and like, I know we've beat this over and over and over again, but like looking at what they really want instead of what they think they want. Because often two parties can sort of see something that they're trading off over and be like, no, we just want all, full control of that. But what they may actually want are different parts of that, or they might interact with that in a different way. And so you can really unlock value for both those players by trying to figure out what exactly they want, figuring out, what their currency is. Again, we just keep coming back to this. And so trying to make it clear that, in fact, that there is this way to capture value that is meaningful, for each stakeholder, to capture value that's meaningful for them, and that those two things don't necessarily have to butt heads. I think is well, and this one professor's sort of career negotiation shows that that's really, really effective. And so if those sorts of situations present themselves, and you can paint a different sort of story instead of the zero-sum story that these folks are sort of telling themselves, then that can be really effective.
I can actually speak to kind of a specific example of that that sort of teases what you're talking about out a little bit more too. And this is more from the choice infrastructure work that I've done, but extremely related. So I live in Chicago, and there is, as in many big cities, city policy has a lot of different odds and ends to it, and getting licenses for things is like a huge business for the city. So I did some work where we were sort of thinking about, in this case, again, seems very niche, food policy and food licensure for street cart vendors. So Chicago has this very rich restaurant scene, but also, as in, again, many big cities, like folks who are running street carts and vendors, who have either tamales or hot dogs, whatnot. And there's this pretty complicated process you have to go through to get a license, and it's got all sorts of, as a user-centered or whatever, it's a mess. It's a totally disastrous process. It's just incredibly complicated. It changes every 5 minutes. Nobody knows what to do. It's all in English, and many of the vendors are not English speakers, whatever. So in doing this work, we kind of teased out all of these difficult challenges. And in thinking about how to employ choice infrastructure to help address it, some of what we were finding was exactly, I think, what Will and Arthur are both describing. Like, if you are only looking at, for example, the efficiency that your city employees are, grinding through license applicants, if you're only looking at things like efficiency or time spent, you may not be giving people the time and attention they need. There may be repeat visits unnecessarily. There's going to be extra layers of complexity just because you've been focusing on certain kinds of metrics. So that to me is sort of this interesting example of where certain highly measurable things, which seem desirable, like efficiency and getting people out the door, is actually working against your greater goals, which are actually the effectiveness of like giving people the information they need and teeing them up for success because you've told them, oh, you should expect this in 2 weeks, and if you don't, come back to us. Right, so the things which are actually in some ways self-evident, and maybe again this speaks to the transparency point that Arthur brought up a couple of times earlier too. Focusing on not just the metrics piece of it, but the process was one piece. But also in that case, what we were finding interesting is like, if Chicago is going to maintain its reputation and status as this great food city, part of what that means is also supporting the food vendors, right? And that idea of like Chicago as leading food city is hard to measure. It's definitely more diffuse than many of the other things, but it also really speaks to that point of pride and identity, right? So in that case, you're not only focusing on the numbers, but you're also kind of making this, statement and reframe in terms of what feels important, and how can you, even if you're just a city hall employee, you can be helping towards this broader goal of like making Chicago #1 or whatever Chicago is right now. That sense of not diminishing the numbers piece, but also broadening the sense of what is considered valuable and what is kind of worth your time and energy and effort, because you're looking across just a broader set of what success looks like, and sort of socializing that, and absolutely then finding good ways to measure it later makes a lot of sense. But that just kinship and identity is actually sort of an underutilized leverage point as well. And you can be playing chords. Maybe that's another way to think of it, is that sometimes it's sort of a top-down leverage that you're sort of employing to get people to do things, but sometimes you're thinking of identity, sometimes you're thinking about kind of future gains, right? There are a variety of different types of value that we can all think to at once.
I think it's such an important question of like how you reframe the game, and I'll share an example of just thinking about not just positive sum design but positive sum activism that we were kind of exploring on our campus with relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is kind of very much seen by all parties, most parties, as a kind of zero-sum kind of situation, right? And I think a lot of us on campus were very exhausted by that. So we were asking a similar kind of question in the context of that. So we started, we started to try to think about some of these positive sum principles and like, how can we reframe this in a different way? It's something that seems like, to your point, that like just seems like there's such a headwind that how do you change that conversation? And so, first of all, what we did is we didn't take for granted that everything was zero sum. We looked for stakeholders. We kind of acknowledged that we were like people like in the United States, we don't experience occupation, we don't experience kind of living in those situations. We're here to learn about this situation. Who can we learn from? And so we started looking for stakeholders that were operating within these positive sum dynamics. So, for example, schools. I don't know if you're familiar with the hand-in-hand school. We had a speaker come from there that talks that Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis learn together. And they learn in Arabic and Hebrew, and all these kind of positive sum kinds of outcomes that come of that. People that are working on entrepreneurship together to create an economy that mutually benefits both people. And the point is that the more we looked and the more we listened and tried to kind of like suspended our own kind of perspectives or investments in that situation, the more we just allowed ourselves to try to identify the value where we didn't see before, to even suspend our own biases and based on our own identities, and just coming from my own perspective, kind of where I was coming from that, we discovered that there was so much other value that we were missing there, and that there are people on the ground that in this particular situation that are creating more value together. And the tragedy and the hope that came out of that, at least for me, is that yes, it's possible, but why aren't more people thinking like this? Why aren't more people doing this kind of work? And so I don't. And that's not like a full answer to the question, because I think it's one of the big questions we're grappling with. It's like, how do you change the dynamic that the world is so zero sum? Maybe it's culturally constructed. Maybe, as we're kind of alluding to, it's kind of baked into who we are in some ways, but we're not. It's not our destiny necessarily. We can find ways to being creative by creatively reframing the way we see these things to be able to find more value for everybody. It is possible. We just have to, I think, be humble and be students of kind of these situations and kind of try to invite those experiences to into our world so that we can benefit and learn from them and learn how to create more value that way. We're probably short on time.
So,
yeah.
We are just about out of time. So if you do have any sort of closing remarks that you'd like to share with the audience, that would be fantastic.
Do either of you have anything you want to say? Sorry.
Lots to say.
So much.
Except I wasn't thinking. I was just going to actually add one sort of quick thing, but maybe
Sure.
it can take the form of a closing
Well,
remark.
share with us. We can.
Well, no, it was only, I think part of what is important is to take, even though yes, absolutely being optimistic about what we can reframe, I think there's also what that final question kind of articulated or was pointing to, is that we live in the context of a lot of really stable systems that are not healthy. Stable systems are not necessarily healthy systems, and healthy systems are sometimes unstable, but stable systems do like to stay that way, if that makes sense. So recognizing where we can disrupt or destabilize, I think, is sort of a big piece of the puzzle here. Figuring out where there are leverage points, and not everything is going to be equally successful. But also, recognizing, I think, I don't think anyone here, the intent is not to be Pollyanna-ish.
No.
Do people even use that term anymore, Pollyanna? Speaking like overly optimistic about everything. But recognizing that there is hard work to do, but also that, yes, thinking in terms of solving for different kinds of systems at the very least, as we do this, we'll be learning more and more about what kind of works. Because I think as designers, we do have this goal, this tendency, this sort of urge to be systematic where we can. It's this wonderful combination of being creative about problem solving, but also to sort of see what patterns exist and how to problem solve in a more effective and systematic way. So yeah, I guess that's a closing remark too. I think that evolving this into sort of that system sensibility while not losing at its core the fact that this is a genuinely human challenge, right? We have to be working on both levels at once in order to make any headway, because I think only attacking the system stuff diminishes the fact that like there are all sorts of reasons that humans are just wired the way we are, and kind of recognizing where we need to be designing for both halves. So I don't know, that was a little bit of a ramble, but.
That's great. I just had, yeah, do you wanna?
I just had a couple of like last
Yeah.
things, and Will, did you?
I do, but go ahead, you go first, Dorothy.
Mine's more just like this, along with any classes that I teach, whenever we talk about anything a lot, I start to see it everywhere in the world, and so one of the things that we're doing, or I'm doing, is putting together a list of examples. So I'm seeing, positive sum or reframing zero sum everywhere, from like late night comedy shows to, the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and so forth. And so I think there's examples of this all over the place. And one thing that I would love to ask you all to do, and folks here, is on our website we have like a little forum area, and pull examples, find examples. If you see ones that are great examples of positive sum or great examples of zero sum that you think should be changed, or whatever it happens to be, I think this is an evolving conversation, and one that is appropriate for this time, because there are so many problems, like Ian alluded to, climate change, and there's a lot of things happening in the world that working as zero sum may not quite work. And I would just encourage you all to look for the examples and see it in your world, and try to engage with it.
I'd like to go even further than that. I think as we
Well, you're their
alluded to,
professor. You're allowed to ask them too.
we're still working through this ourselves, and we're trying. One of the reasons we want to have this conversation today is, first of all, to share some of the discussions that we've been having, but also to invite you into the conversation. We would love to hear what you think and help us broaden this and make it deeper. And we're interested in collaborating on projects together. We're talking about writing things. We've been writing things together. We want to do more design projects. We want to bring this more into the classroom. So feel free to reach out. We meet regularly on Tuesdays. You're more than welcome to join our conversations. We'd love to find further engagement with some of these ideas. So if you want to come grab my email, we have maybe we can send out the website, but you can also email me directly or email any of us directly, and we can we'd love to connect with you. So am I leaving anything out? I know we're a little bit short on time because technically class ends at 3:20, but any other final thoughts or quick thoughts?
The last thing I wanted to say was, please, if you take anything away from this, think about how in your life, in your work, you can think about how you can find one of those beginnings of infinity, one of those sources of sort of infinite value, and bring that to yourself, your friends, your family, the people who you serve through your work. That's a lot of what we're trying to do today, and I think it's really important. And I'm glad to have you all thinking about this with all of us.
Okay, well, Ruth, Will, Arthi, Ian, thank you so much for the incredibly fascinating discussion today.
Thank you for sharing your Friday afternoon with us, guys.
Take care.
Will and Ruth, it was great to see you guys.
All right, everybody who's in class. Unfortunately, we ran a little bit long, but we still have important stuff to do. Anybody who wants to place an order, we have to do that this afternoon. So unless you receive